The Mystery of BELICENA VILLCA. Fourth Book. Quest for Uncle Kurt. Chapter 17. I promised myself to not interrupt more Uncle Kurt. His relation prosecuted thus. According to the papers signed and sealed that contained the packet given by the SS Oberfuhrerpap, was already member of the Schutzstaffeln, Guard Echelons or SS, and was going to receive the training to the Edensburg at XVII, incorporated with the grade of SS Obersturmführer, Lieutenant in German. To the SS, was entered normally, for the career of officer, with the grade of SS Untersturmführer, but the graduated from the Nepala, for their previous military preparation, were incorporated with one grade more. For this reason, I impressed as SS Obersturmführer, of the legendary 1st Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, and because the Ostenführer of the selective body of Eastern Studies of the Nepala had his natural seat in the Leibstandarte. The SS officers received instruction in centers, especially prepared for the effect, in different places of Germany. With the Edensburg castle monasteries surrounded by forests and parks, self-sufficient in regard to the pedagogic finality for which they had been disposed. 3 Edensburg depended of the NSDAP, and 1, the castle of Welsburg, belonged exclusively to the Waffen-SS. Crossing Sie in eastern Prussia was occupied of the physical and mental training, and to complete the instruction purely military. Vogelsam, in Rhenania, imparted the political and mystic training and, at last, Senthofen in Baviera, was occupied of the superior formation of the SS officers in politics, diplomacy or martial arts. To these 3 births, Crossing Sie, Vogelsam, and Senthofen, was concurred in that order, being able to remain 1 or more years in each one of them according to the particular followed career. But, to the Welsburg, only ingressed an authentic elite, extraordinarily selected, that aspired to receive the initiation to the most hidden knowledge of the Black Order SS, whose great master was the rich Führer Heinrich Himmler. In my particular case, existed express orders of Rudolf Hess to accelerate the staying at Crossing Sie and the Vogelsam, so I just assisted 3 months to the first Berg, and 3 months to the second. In Senthofen, I stayed 6 months, and then, I passed 3 months in Benno nearby Berlin, a secret center of the SD where was imparted the teaching in techniques of counter-espionage. In total, 15 large and harsh months of study that concluded at the ends of 1938, when, with the grade of SS Obersturmführer, Captain in German, I abandoned definitely the official halls and libraries in quality of student. Since my arrival to Germany, in 1933, had elapsed 6 years during which I received an education of elite, so specific and good, conceived for what was desired to obtain of me, that it is difficult to imagine how it could have been improved. In the date, continued Kurt, Germany, and her allies, were going to enter in a total war, against the potencies of the matter, war, which was more terrible than the one of the Mahabharata, and, when times ran out, I had the opportunity to act in benefice of my homeland and the humanity. In fact, before the outbreak of the conflict, I received my first mission, a so strange enterprise that would be difficult to fit it in within the military operations, especially in our days, where the professional armies are well-oiled machines, and the soldiers simple robots. But is that the Waffen-SS was not an organization merely military but the external expression of the Black Order, an order of Hyperborean entities. Then existed, along with the operations classically military, missions of pure esoteric character. One of these was the operational Western that the Professor SHCAEFFER had undertaken in 1937, funded and directed by the SS. As Rudolf Hess had anticipated, my destiny was attached to such expedition to the Tibet, and nobody, neither the traitor Schaefer, could prevent me to participate on it. However, in 1937, the group had already left, and just 1 year later, I incorporated with them in that Tibet. The previous circumstances were not less strange, but I'll narrate you them after we have taken the dinner, Uncle Kurt said surprisingly. He watched his clock, and lifted his hand to the brow with astonishment. I'm an inconsiderate. Since 5 hours ago that I am entertaining you without noticing that this is the first time that you leave the bed in 15 days. Are you fine really? Tell me the truth, because it might be better if you rest, and I send up you the dinner. I am very well, Uncle Kurt. While we were going to the dining hall. 1 hour later, we were returning to the armchairs after a cold and light dinner, based in cold meat and salads, during which we spoke of many themes completely disconnected from the interrupted narration. Finally, while we were drinking a cup of coffee, Uncle Kurt decided to go on with the relation. It's a beautiful summer evening, he said. I suggest you that sit down under the willows nif. You'll see that you enjoy the coolness of the night as we move forward with the story. Oh no, I replied. It'd be better if we return to the living room. There, we'll be more comfortable. I lamented to mess up the enthusiasm of Uncle Kurt, but I don't wanted to face the daggers. I knew that sooner or later, I would have to do it, but I'd procure to do it on daylight. The daggers at night again? The idea filled me with apprehension, but Uncle Kurt did not notice it, because he shrugged his shoulders, and went to the living room followed by me. 3 or 4 weeks later, arriving to Crossing Z, I returned to Berlin. Uncle Kurt continued relating, to interview Konrad Tarstein, my contact in Gesellschaft. The Grugerstrasse 239 corresponded to an ancient barn of 2 floors that had to count with more than 2 centuries of venturesome existence, and the only inhabitant, Konrad Tarstein, resulted to be a typical Berliner petit bourgeois, bald, short stature, with thick belly, who fitted perfectly with the decrepitude of the place. It is probable that such place and man, I thought, had as objective to mislead possible spies, or disappoint unquiet aspirants. I suffered the second effect of tugging a mouldy shackle which turned around inside a bronze fist doubtfully fixed to the shabby door. Yes? Asked a startling voice that emerged from some undefined place. I am Kurt von Subeman, I said, talking to the tiny eye-hole that at last I had discovered in one of the panels of the door, whence a pair of elusive little eyes were looking at me impatient. Herr Rudolf Hess sends me. The door was opened, and a chubby and small figure appeared, with the hand courteously extended to salute. I am Konrad Tarstein, he said. Come in, I was waiting for you. The interior not improved in nothing the first impression. Furnished with manifested tastelessness, in a neglected mix of forms and styles, a few minutes in the house were enough for anyone to be discouraged that there was, or could be something important. And nevertheless, I expected a lot of that Gesellschaft in which, according to Rudolf Hess, I'd find answer to all my queries. Seated in a ridiculous divan Louis XV, which seemed to have nothing to do there, before a Norman table, and some friar chairs, I observed with surprise that Konrad Tarstein was going to fill a sheet. Was the furthest thing from a spiritual activity that I could imagine, and, for this reason, I hesitated to give my personal data, attitude that Tarstein interpreted erroneously as product of the fear. Don't be afraid, said Tarstein, the books of the order could be never found. I can assure you, Herr von Subeman, that never has occurred an important filtration about the details of the cult, or the identity of our members. We have suffered desertions, and some minor betrayal, but always in the superficial levels of the order, and by people who not possessed a very precise knowledge of the internal organization. Do you receive many aspirants, Mr. Tarstein? I asked. Konrad Tarstein lifted the sight from the sheet, and observed me some large minutes with curiosity. Finally, as if I'd have noticed a forgetfulness, or omission, he took a hand up to his brow, while his countenance went illuminated with a smile. The circumspection of Rudolf Hess, he said thinking aloud. his eternal and timid circumspection. I must have supposed that you would not be warned that this interview doesn't form part of any regular practice in the Gesellschaft. Tell me, Kurt von Saberman, what information received Rudolf Hess to reach here? I responded him, in a complete form about all what I knew about the Gesellschaft. What Rudolf Hess had said in our conversation in the Chancellery, the night of the graduation, and the reference of a contact in Berlin, Konrad Tarstein, exposed in his letter that reached to my hands through the SS Oberfuhrer Pap. While I was talking, a doubt that an unexpected misunderstanding would have occurred assaulted me, provoked by some mistake committed by me in the interpretation of the instructions. But, as much as reflected, I didn't find any motive that could have produced the surprise of Tarstein before my question about the reception of other aspirants to the Gesellschaft. Or is that, effectively, never came other aspirants to the Gregorstrasse 239? Finally, Konrad Tarstein confirmed me this a few minutes later. He approved with a gesture of his bald head everything what I said, and, after that, he kept the sheet in a leather briefcase. He invited me to pass to an interior ambient of the enormous barn. The hall, where we were, was connected with the door of the street, through a passage from the small hall. At the right, was a stair of fine polished wood and carpeted, which, through a 90-degree bend, guided to the superior floor, and continued in the railing, which was extended sideways along a passage, perfectly visible from below. Towards the front of the hall, two big doors of huge carved wooden frames opened. Taking the right door, we acceded, with Tarstein, to an open courtyard, surrounded by galleries with small columns beneath Norman X, in each one of them enormous gates opened. Following the gallery of the left side, we perambulated the distance of a side of the tiling courtyard, and we continued through a transversal stone door which guided us to another courtyard, this one, closed with a glass campaign, while the gallery was extended along this courtyard to dying wall at the background. Before reaching there, we entered in the last of the countless doors that guided to the transposed galleries. The site where we had arrived, after such labyrinthine excursion, was really amazing. At closing the door that guided to gallery, I'd say that we were entering into an apartment, more proper to be in the skyscraper of the Brennerverstrasse than there, in the heart of the decadent mansion of the 18th century. Are you surprised, Mr. Kurt? Konrad Tarstein asked, smiling. I remodeled a wing of this ancient house, to live with some cosigns. Nothing from the other world, rather simple, but comfortable for whom has already traveled great part of the final path. See, Kurt, this is the kitchen, modern and well installed. These ones are the dinner room and the living room. See, these are the bedrooms. There are two because I usually receive a marriage of old friends as guests. Come over here, Kurt. See, this is the main ambience, where I spend great part of the day and night. We were before a bedroom of great dimensions, with the four walls covered of shelves with books. In the center, under a squared lamp, and of regulable height, which hanged from the roof, a table covered in books, some of them opened, others stacked, and many manuscripts, permitted to guess the place for work, or study of Konrad Tarstein. A little overwhelmed by the particular spectacle that I was witnessing, and containing the desires to go immediately and examine the cover of the books, which evidently were very ancient, I contained my anxiety and asked, "Why here? Why to build a house inside of another? It is not more feasible to acquire another property more comfortable in a more respectable neighborhood." Calm, Kurt, said Tarstein, this has been done thus, by an important reason. We can't abandon this property, which is very valuable for us. Many important things have happened here for Germany and the humanity. Wherefore, although few are those who visit it, often we've maintained it intact, without changing anything of its ancient and baffling furniture. 30 years ago, in 1908, worked here a secret group, whose members founded in 1912, the Germanenorden, that later would give place to the Gesellschaft and the NSDAP. Do you understand now why we must conserve this house? Because here all began, I said with admiration. Exactly, here all began to be written about the history of the next millennium. Here, only here, came the superior unknowns to seal the foundation of the Third Reich. Berlin will fall before a pin of its foundations could be touched in this sacred house. When Konrad Tarstein was speaking in this way, his startling voice acquired prophetic tones, and it was turning magnetic and attractive, making me forget for some moments the extravagant aspect of who emitted it. "Let's take a coup of coffee," proposed Tarstein, "and I will impose you certain things that you must know concerning to the Gesellschaft, and of the arrangement that we have made with Rudolf Hess, about your ingress." I accompanied him, lamenting to leave such fascinating library, until the superb kitchen. We left the library, and by another door, adjacent to the one whence we entered, and we went out to the gallery, and the courtyard again. I comprehended thus, that the house of Konrad Tarstein was extended to around all that wing of the ancient mansion, in front of the second floor. How many rooms had the house? I asked while I was sweetening the aromatic tea of Shanghai. "Reckoning both floors, some 30 or 32 ambients," replied enigmatically. "Who could know it?" He looked at me a large instant, as doubting if he should stop there, or complete the answer. Finally, something on him seemed to get relaxed, and he opted for the second alternative. "Look, Kurt, I don't know if you will be prepared or ready to accept certain facts that escape to the normal comprehension of the common man. Anyhow, as we pretend to make of you a Hyperborean initiate, sooner or later, such facts won't result you surprising at all. It's just a matter of time to understand them. Therefore, I'll give you information that, for any rational mind, would be logically incredible, but it won't be for us, because it corresponds to most rigorous truth, perfectly ascertainable by every initiate. In this house, today, can be 32 ambients, but, tomorrow, perhaps, be 35, 40 or more. Or maybe less, 20, 25, 30, who could know it? Naturally, if such revelation provoked me, the incomprehension that Tarstein foresaw. Do not forget that I was 19 years old, and that I was still confused by the recently acquired faculty to hear the voice of Kiev, the Lord of Venus. However, I not felt exalted, and I took his words with tranquility. Konrad Tarstein prosecuted, apparently satisfied by the neutral effect that his information caused. "This is not a common house, Kurt. No sir, you're inside of what we call a liberated area, a PITM, that is to say, a space gamed to the enemy. Even though you just see walls surrounding the edified area, they just cover a strategic fence, denominated a Kemone, or Velabeso, which separates and isolates the area of the Velplades, or enemy territory, it means, of the campus belly. You cannot perceive the Kemone, because you are not initiated yet, and your soul obstructs your spiritual vision. Only your uncultured spirit is apt to capture the charismatic fence of the Kemone. But, you'll see it, Kurt, you'll see it. And then, you'll understand that, what seems impossible is real, and that the house is not geometrically stable, because its structure doesn't participate exclusively from the created archetypes, as every house, but on it intervenes an uncreated element, the actual infinite." After this announcement, Tarstein sighed and said, "Here, Kurt, time elapses in another way, synchronized from the exterior time, the time of the world. For this reason, in this liberated area, and with this own time, the construction can't be stable, and not only its sectors change, but they change synchronistically with the interior time. Centuries and millenniums of distance could be saved at crossing through one of these doors. By one of such apertures of time and space, arrived once my ancestors, the lords of Tharsis of the Germanic branch, who belonged to a medieval order historically known as Einherjar. You must know that my surname Tarstein means Stone of Tharsis. In memory of a legendary house that traces its racial origins to the white Atlantans, the survivors of the Atlantis. I know that this will seem fantastic to you, but I descend from a lineage that remained hidden for centuries, due to the tenacious persecution, mortal persecution, to which they were subjected by the potencies of the matter, that's to say, that occult hierarchy, led by tenebrous extraterrestrial beings established in Shambhala. I will be clearer. My family, the Germanic branch of the Lords of Tharsis, was natal of Swabia, country where they had settled with the major secret of the 13th century, fleeing from a legendary attack of the demons, which almost exterminates our entire lineage. There, they remained for 4 centuries, conserving the Hyperborean wisdom that had been entrusted in remote times to our house. In the 16th century, a Hyperborean pontiff, coming from England, founded in the court of the Emperor Rudolf II, in Prague, the Order Reinhardt, which had as objective to develop and apply in every moment of the history an exact method to localize the advent of the Lord of the Absolute Will, the envoy of the Lord of the War, that's to say, the Führer of the white race. In such a moment, the pontiff decided that the better strategy for sustenance and perdurability of the order demanded that its members be always from 8 chosen bloodliners amongst the lineages of the purest blood of Europe. The case was that one of the convoked princes by the pontiff belonged to my family, whereas the other came from the house of Brandenburger, from a collateral lineage of the Hohenzollern. The order worked in secrecy during the next centuries, forming Hyperborean initiates, and awaiting the time of the arrival of the great chief of the white race. The most important base of action was constituted by the Margraviato of Brandenburger, which was since the 12th century, a hereditary princedom feudalized with the emperor. And precisely, the presence of the order is not strange to the posterior ascent of the House of Brandenburg above the rest princedoms of Europe, until the obtention of the king's investiture reached by Frederick William III in 1791. Then, born as Prussia, the state where the national rector principle was the honor, where the family was organized around the authoritarian and exemplary figure of the father, where the order prevailed in all the social classes, nobility, bourgeoisie and peasantry, because it was affirmed in the notions strongly ingrained on the line of duty, the saving of the unconditional obedience of the subaltern, in the entire subordination of the functionaries, and in the most rigid military discipline. But, overall, Prussia was since the beginning a military state. 2/3 of its budget was dedicated to the support of powerful national army that infringed defeats to France, Austria, Russia, etc. and impulsed respect and admiration for the austere and lordly Prussian way of life. And with the art of the war, there was cultivated the philosophy, the literature, the music. But nothing in this revolution occurred accidentally. The Edda was training, in a society of pure blood, the new order that the Führer, in his next coming, would apply to all Germany and the world. It is for this reason that the Führer has never hidden his debt with Prussia, and he has made public his sympathy for Frederick II of Prussia, and Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor. Well, Kurt, the ancient order Reinhardt was so strengthened in the 19th century, that one of its initiates reached to be crowned King of Prussia in 1840. I am referring to Frederick William the Fat, called courteously Damian of Brandenburg, due to his love for the eloquence and in memory of the famous rhetorician Theseus. Was the same king that reconstructed the Marienburg, the castle which served as residence in the Middle Ages, to the great masters of the Teutonic order. This restoration work, as you all know, is prosecuted nowadays by a special division of the SS, obeying direct orders of the rich Führer Himmler. And was the same king who, considering that the old danger had yielded, and that the demons could not prevent any more, that the new order be imposed in the world, authorized the creation of the surname Tharstein or Tarstein contraction of Tharsistin, accompanied the nobiliary title of Earl, and the right to exhibit in the castle of the house the familiar armorial shield. The castle of Tarstein is located very near from here, Kurt, at some 100 kilometers from Berlin, but I do not frequent it since many years ago, because I am totally committed to work for the Belicenna and the Black Order SS. Come here, Kurt. I'll show something very secret and related to this matter. Then, he introduced me through the exterior corridor to a nearby room, hermetically closed, with double lock. Once inside, another nourished library was revealed at my sight. In 2 walls should be deposited some 4,000 books, many of them of evident antiqueness. On the other wall, are shelves filled with documents and rolls. All this material has a common characteristic, he explained. It refers to the Druids and the Druidism. Many of these documents are very secret and have been obtained at a high price. They proceed from all Europe and correspond to all the ages until today. Is, with security, the most complete collection that anyone has ever united about the Druids. But, I exclaimed surprised, don't with the Druids, historic personages already disappeared? You talk as if they still exist. I mentioned before the fact that my family, the House of Tharsis, was obeyed to flee 7 centuries ago, due to an attack of the demons. Well, those demons were Druids, or Galeen, as my ancestors denominated them. And, thenceforth, their power has never decreased. On the contrary, it could be affirmed that, today is stronger than ever. But, keep present this, Kurt. If the strategy at the Führer's triumph, and someday the Third Reich, ends reign over humanity, we must outbreak against the Gauleans, one of our great esoteric battles, that in Europe, are constituted in mainstay of the Synarchy. But, who are they? Where are they? I asked astonished. In the Middle Ages, his center of action was the Catholic Church. He replied thoughtfully, where, it seems, they were fought fiercely by members of my family. After the 14th century, more concretely, subsequently, to the destruction of the Order of the Temple, that obeyed to their inspiration, they strengthened, and spread in that diverse states of the European society. Today, there are almost no organizations where the Gauleans are not infiltrated. I know that, with this answer, I don't clarify you too much. But afterwards I'll describe you the complete structure of the Synarchy, and then, you'll be able to comprehend functionally the role that they perform in nowadays and will identify them easily. If I have shown you now this library and mentioned the Gauleans, is not to respond to the natural curiosity that it would arouse in you, but to make you a serious admonition. Have you heard about the hunting by species? Well, I think so. Isn't the one that consists in which each hunter must collect a piece of a determined species? As a game, in which a hunter must chase, for example, a hare, the other a rabbit, and a third a pheasant, the fourth of turkey, etc. Exactly, Kurt confirmed Tarstein. Then listen to this, and keep it well in your mind. Analogously to the hunting by species, within the hunters of the Synarchy, the Druids are in charge to collect pieces of your species. I stayed looking at him, without understanding, or without wanting to. He repeated. Of your species, Kurt von Superman. I would not know to say what resulted more astounding to me, if the story that Tarstein had related, undoubtedly true, or to know that I was in front of an earl, a noble of a very ancient lineage. For his citizen appearance, for his humble and chivalrous treatment, for his costume of questionable quality, I would have hardly suspected it. I was inheriting a nobiliary title as well. However, something interior, an inexplicable intuition, was telling me that his blood was purer, that his lineage was the older, that his nobility was superior to mine. Of his advisement about the peril of the Druids, of course, I ignored it. Before leaving, he took some typewritten sheets from the shelves of documents, and gave them to me. These are, he said me, the transcription of the article Druidism, of the British Encyclopedia. Read them. That will refresh your memory. He locked the door of the Druidic library, and we returned to the kitchen. I was drinking another cup of coffee, confused for the revelations of Tarstein, when he, who had left one moment before, came back. I went to my studio to bring this manuscript. He showed me a book, skillfully bound, and handwritten with exquisite Gothic characters. Its title is, Secret History of Gesellschaft. I wrote it, employing knowledges, which are completely secret, and that in Germany, only a few initiates know in part. You'll be able to read it afterwards, but, you mustn't take it out from this house, because, it's the only copy that exists, and the secrets contained there, could change the politic organization of the planet, if they fall in the hands of the enemy. Here, is explained, for example, how did the initiates of the Order Reinhardt to determine that Adolf Hitler was the Führer of the white race, and, how they guided him to the power, and the intermediary orders which they had to found, as the Germanenorden, and the Gesellschaft, till reaching to the order possessor of the Hyperborean wisdom, on its highest grade, that is to say, the Black Order SS. It is obvious the avidity with which I observed such manuscript, wishing to have the possibility to read it right there. The words sounded mysteriously in the mouth of Tarstein, and this impression was accentuated by the unreality of the place, where centuries were crossed with just walking some meters by the corridor. To you Depot Hess, continued Tarstein, changing of matter, I know him, since he appeared in Munich in 1919. Was a young student of geopolitics, when he ingressed, in that year, to the Gesellschaft. However, we recognized in him, one of the great spirits of Germany, who was going to be the shield-bearer of the King Arthur. A Parsifal, whose mission would not be, this time, the quest for the Grail, but the sacrifice to take sit in the dangerous seat during the crisis of the kingdom, this place number 13 in the round table, that only can occupy a pure madman a knight, capable to do a madness of love, to save the kingdom. For this reason, Rudolf has been always next to the Führer, waiting for his time, as the loyal knight. And, everyone must desire that his opportunity never come, because, when Parsifal begins, his mission that would mean that the King Arthur is hurt, and that the kingdom is Tragaster. I assented with a gesture before the inquisitor gaze of Tarstein, but, the mute answer not impressed him at all. You don't understand completely what I say, don't you? It must be thus, due to. Who would be capable to understand the pure madman? His mission is not earthly. The victory, if he triumphs, can be only celebrated in another heavens. A few will be the ones who will applaud the anonymous hero that is in Rudolf Hess. And, however, of him depends in great measure the triumph of the Führer. How much meaning would have these words, that Tarstein was telling me, in such first visit to the Griggerstrasse 239, 4 years later, when in 1941, Rudolf was eager to face bravely to the elemental Wassen. But, such Saturday of 1937, the war, and all the horror that would come, were still far away, in a future that I could not suspect. On the other hand, the commentaries of Tarstein caused my certain pride, in the quality of godson of Rudolf Hess, and with a pleasant sensation, I was foolishly smiling, without deepening in the occult sense, that was behind the symbology of the Arthurian legend. I'll not extend about this first visit, because, it was not much more what we talked. After an hour, in accordance with what I remember, I left from there submersed in a sea of doubts, but with a strong purpose, to continue till the end. Rudolf Hess had interposed his influence to send me with Conrad Tarstein, whoever he could be, and I was not disposed to defraud him. 1 hour later, on the train, I was reading the article of the British Encyclopedia. Was not a lot what the English said about the Druids. Druidism was the faith of the Celtic inhabitants of Gaul, until the time of the Romanization of their country, and of the Celtic population of the British Isles either up to the time of the Romanization of Britain, or, in parts remote from Roman influence, up to the period of the introduction of Christianity. From the standpoint of the available sources, the subject presents two distinct fields for inquiry, the first being pre-Roman and Roman Gaul, and the second pre-Christian and early Christian Ireland and Pictland. In the present state of knowledge, it is difficult to assess the interrelation of Druidic paganism. Gaul, the earliest mention of Druids, is reported by Diogenes Laertius, Vita, Intro 1 and 5, and was found in a lost work by a Greek, Sotion of Alexandria, written about 200 before Christ, a date when the greater part of Gaul had been Celtic for more than 2 centuries, and the Greek colonies had been even longer established on the south coast. The Gallic Druids, which were subsequently described by Caesar, were an ancient order of religious officials, for when Sotion wrote they already possessed a reputation as philosophers in the outside world. Caesar's account, however, is the mainspring of present information, and it is an especially valuable document as Caesar's confidant and friend, the Edwin noble Diviciacus, was himself a Druid. Caesar's description of the Druids, Commentary of Bello Gallico, 6, emphasizes their political and judicial functions. Although they officiated at sacrifices, and taught the philosophy of their religion, they were more than priests. Thus, at the annual assembly of the order near Chartres, it was not to worship nor to sacrifice that the people came from afar, but to present their disputes for lawful trial. Moreover, it was not only minor quarrels that the Druids decided, for their functions included the investigation of the gravest criminal charges, and even intertribal disputes. Himmel! I exclaimed, while I suspended the lecture for a moment. Is that I am so influenced by the doctrine of the Führer, that I see Jews far and wide? Well, how deny it? Such judge priests, with their wide-fed, seem for me Levites of pure Hebrew race. You're not wrong, affirmed in my mind the voice of Kiev. The Druids are Hebrew. One day you'll know the truth. I continued reading. This, together with the fact that they acknowledge the authority of an arch-druid invested with supreme power, shows that their system was conceived on a national basis, and was independent of ordinary intertribal jealousy. And, if to this political advantage is added their influence over educated public opinion, as the chief instructors of the young, and, finally, the formidable religious sanction behind their decrees, it is evident that, before the clash with Rome, the Druids must very largely have controlled the civil administration of Gaul. This absolute might, as in the pieces in the war, this intermediation between the heaven and earth, this capacity to form the people, in all the stratums, this authority to judge and legislate, was not analogous to an Aaron, Joshua, a Samuel, some Levites. It means, such tribe of Israel to whom Jehovah entrusted the mission to officiate the cult of the law. Questions without answer by the moment, but questions that gave pass to very suggestive intuitions. Thus followed the article. Of Druidism itself, little is said, except that the Druids taught the immortality of the human soul, maintaining that it passed into other bodies after death. This belief was identified by later the writers, such as Diodorus Siculus, with the Pythagorean doctrine, but probably incorrectly, for there is no evidence that the Druidic belief included the notion of a chain of successive lives as a means of ethical purification, or that it was governed by a doctrine of moral retribution, having the liberation of the soul as the ultimate hope, and this seems to reduce the Druidic creed to the level of ordinary religious speculation. Very contradictory, I thought in the train. It is quite improbable that some barbarian populaces, as the Celts, be submitted by millions to the religious leading, moral and judicial, of judge priests, retired in the forests, which only sustained a mere religious common speculation. Something patent had to exhibit the Druids, something superior to a mere rational speculation, something that for the Celts, was the truth. Of the theology of Druidism, Caesar tells us that the Gauls, following the Druidic teaching, claimed descent from a god, corresponding with Dis in the Latin pantheon, and it is possible that they regarded him as a supreme being. He also adds that they worshipped Mercury, Apollo, Mars, Jupiter and Minerva, and had much the same notion about these deities as the rest of the world. In short, Caesar's remarks imply that there was nothing in the Druidic creed, apart from the doctrine of immortality, that made their faith extraordinary, so that it may be assumed that Druidism professed all the known tenets of ancient Celtic religion, and that the gods of the Druids were the familiar and multifarious deities of the Celtic pantheon. Here, the English author of the article exaggerated. Nowhere, before this last paragraph, had said, or suggested that the Druids were something different to the Celts, except that they formed an official order of priests. But now, clearly, he hinted that were the same that the ancient Celts sustained. Then, who were the Druids, if they were not Celts? And why the Celts would have changed their religion after the, now very probable, advent of the Druids? Questions without answers. Questions for Konrad Tarstein. The philosophy of Druidism does not seem to have survived the test of Roman acquaintance, and was doubtless a mixture of astrology and mythical cosmogony. Cicero, De Divin. XLI, 90, says that Diviciacus boasted a knowledge of physiologia, but Pliny decided eventually natural history, X, 13, that the lore of the Druids was little else than a bundle of superstitions. Of the religious rites themselves, Pliny NH, XVI, 249, has given an impressive account of the ceremony of culling, the mistletoe, and Diodorus Siculus, Hist. V. 31, 225, describes their divinations by means of the slaughter of a human victim. Caesar, having already mentioned the burning alive of men in wicker cages. It is likely that these victims were malefactors, and it is accordingly possible that such sacrifices were rather occasional national purgings than the common practice of the Druids. I was wrong, or the encyclopedia was trying, with subjective argument, to give a good image of the Druids' murderers. Because, one thing is to be an executioner, unpleasant task, but socially necessary, and other very different is to be a priest-sacrificer of human victims. Men can justify the executioners, but the executed is guilty for breaking the law. To kill who breaks the common law is commonly comprehensible. But the priests kill to appease a god of whom they are their representatives, and propitiate a human sacrifice which is usually incomprehensible. Only they represent him, and only the god can justify them. I realized then that it was treating about a great favor that the English were doing at presenting the crimes of so sinister priests as natural acts of justice. The advent of the Romans quickly led to the downfall of the Druidic order. The rebellion of Vercingetorix must have ended their intertribal organization, since some of the tribes held aloof from the conflict, or took the Roman side. Furthermore, at the beginning of the Christian era, their cruel practices brought the Druids into direct conflict with Rome, and led, finally, to their official suppression. And the contradictions continued. A legalistic people as the Roman, how is that they didn't comprehend that the ritual murders of the Druids were positive acts of justice, according to the conviction that the writer expressed on previous screeds? Or, perhaps, the narrator, connoisseur of the history, was struggling between his duty to expose the real events, and an order of directives of the encyclopedia, or of other persons of singular influence, by which was obeyed to exalt the good of the Druidism, very little by the way, and hide the bad, which was a lot, or to sweeten the unconcealed. As you'll see if this was the theory of Konrad Tarstein. At the end of the 1st century, their status had sunk to that of mere magicians, and in the 2nd century, there is no reference to them. A poem of Ausonius, however, shows that in the 4th century, there were still people in Gaul who boasted of Druidic descent. British Isles. There is one mention of Druids in Great Britain as contemporaries of the Gallic clergy, and that is a reference to them by Tacitus Annals, XIV, 30. from which it is learned that there were elders of that name in Anglesey in 61 before Christ. But there is no mention of the Druids in the whole of the history of Roman England, and it may be questioned whether there ever were any Druids in the eastern provinces that had been subjected, before the Roman invasion, to German influence. On the other hand, there were certainly Druids in Ireland and Scotland, and there is no reason to doubt that the order reaches back in antiquity, at least to the 1st or 2nd century before Christ. The word druid, can only be traced to the 8th century Irish glosses, but there is a strong tradition current in Irish literature that the Druids, and their lore, Druicht, were either of an Aboriginal or Pictish origin. As to Wales, apart from the existence of Druids, in Anglesey there is little to be said except that the earliest of the bards, the Cinfeid, very occasionally called themselves Dewairton. The Irish Druid was a notable person, figuring in the earliest sagas as prophet, teacher and magician. He did not possess, nevertheless, the judicial powers ascribed by Caesar to the Gallic Druids, nor does he seem to have been a member of a national college, an archdruid at its head. Further, there is no mention in any of the texts of the Irish Druids presiding at sacrifices, though they are said to have conducted idolatrous worship, and to have celebrated funeral and baptismal rites. They are best described as seers who were, for the most part, sycophants of princes. Origin. Some confusion is avoided if a distinction is made between the origin of the Druids and the origin of Druidism. Of the officials themselves, it seems most likely that their order was purely Celtic, and that it originated in Gaul, perhaps, as a result of contact with a developed society of Greece. But Druidism, on the other hand, is probably in its simplest terms the pre-Celtic and aboriginal faith of Gaul and the British Isles, that was posted with little modification by the migrating Celts. It is easy to understand that this faith might acquire the special distinction of antiquity in remote districts, such as Britain, and this view would explain the belief expressed to Caesar that the discipline of Druidism was of insular origin. The etymology of the word Druid is still doubtful, but the old Orthodox view taking Druid as a strengthening prefix, and id as meaning knowing, whereby the Druid was a very learned man, has been abandoned in favor of a derivation from an oak word. Pliny's derivation from Greek is, however, improbable. A great revival of interest in the Druids, largely promulgated by the archaeological theories of Aubrey and Sturtley and by Romanticism generally, took place in the 18th and 19th centuries. One outcome of this interest was the invention of Neo-Druidism, an extravagant mixture of Helioarchite theology and Welsh Bardism, and another result is that more than one society has professed itself as inheriting the traditional knowledge and faith of the early Druids. The United Ancient Order of Druids, however, a friendly society founded in the 18th century, makes no such claim. Uncle Kurt had given to me an article of the British Encyclopedia, identical to the one that Tarstein made him read in Germany, 1937. Considering what has been learned recently with respect to the Druids, since they murdered BELICENA VILLCA, and after reading her letter, and received the magisterial explanations of Professor Ramirez, is natural that I shared the criterion of Conrad Tarstein, in the sense that such article was exceedingly resumed and ambiguous to justify its inclusion in so prestigious work. The first edition of the British Encyclopedia dated from 1771, for what should be expected that in 1930, they would have collected enough material about the Druids as to compose a more extensive and complete article. But, resulted obvious that the English not desire to deepen in the history of some ancient and forgotten priests, who could kill right now with renewed efficacy. In the second visit that I did to Conrad Tarstein, Kurt remembered. He approved my reasoning, and assured me that what happened in the article was the most common fact, and he wanted to warn me about that. Wherefore he gave it to me, to advise me that an incredible European conspiracy refused the information or distorted it, with the finality to avoid that unwanted glances could fall about a theme that the most powerful synarchic forces were entrusted to hide. And he warned me again of the, by then incomprehensible, circumstance that I constituted the prey that they would propose to hunt. Finally, if, in regard to the information, was not easy to verify that Tarstein was right, and that he not admitted a simple explanation about the Druidic concealment, which was effectuated in England. This will become evident if you realize a clarify comparison. For example, read the article Druid, in the Encyclopedic Dictionary of Montana and Simon, which is edited in Barcelona, at the end of the 19th century, and you will have no doubt that the English publication is affected by unstrange rickets, although, in the Spanish essay is appreciated the same purpose to express a good image of the Druids. Thereupon, Uncle Kurt put in my hands the 7th volume of the Encyclopedic Dictionary, work of 26 volumes that undoubtedly had minor magnitude than the British Encyclopedia. I searched the article and read: Druid, from the Latin druides, from the Cumbric druizo, druiz dervo, hemoc, priest of the ancient Gauls and Britons. Druid. History. A lot has been discussed about the etymology of the word druida. The etymologists have attended until to the Hebrew dictionaries, to see if on them they could something to give any idea of it. The name druid is an appellation as the main body of the radical substantives of all the languages. In Gaelic language, druid or druidus means soothsayer, augur, magician, and druidh, prophecy and magic. It has been said, as well, this word comes from the Greek voice, which means hemoc, because they dwelled and taught their doctrines in the forests, and because, as Pliny the Elder says, they didn't do sacrifices, but at the feet of the hemoc. But this etymology, even having the reason of the antiquity on its favor, due to, is from the time of Pliny. Not for that reason, it stopped being purely whimsical, because is not so natural that the Druids were going to take their name from a foreign voice. Others sustain that the word druida comes from the Britannic voice, dur or dru, which means hemotu, and that this comes from the Greek voice. From the many Oriental etymologies that have been presented, the most acceptable seems to be the Sanskrit form druid, which means poor indigent, because the Druids, as the priests of all the nations, had to do vows of poverty. The arguments in favor of the Oriental origin of the Druids are very worthy to be attended, because it has been accepted by many writers of the antiquity, but not for other reasons. Diogenes Laertius and Aristotle put the Druids and the Chetans next to the Persian magicians and the Indians, opinion that they share with a great number of writers. The divinity of the Brahmians has a great similitude with the Druidic divinity. The importance that the Druids conceded to the oxen is another singular coincidence. The Druidic mysteries have also great analogy with the mysteries of the India. In the magic wand of the Druids is appreciated the sacred stick of the Brahmians. Both had the same consecrated objects. They used tiaras of cloth, and the symbolic circle of Brahma, as the half-moon, symbol of Shiva, were Druidic ornaments. Great were also the analogies between the idea that the Druids had of a supreme being, and which is found in the sacred works of the India. So it not seems very adventurous to suppose relations amongst the Druids and Indian and Persian priests. According to Caesar, in his work De Bello Gallico, in whose 60th book, he treats about the uses and mores of the Gauls and Germans, the Druidic science was invented in Great Britain, and thence to the Gaul. Although it is evident that the Gauls were dwelt before them Britain and Ireland, is, in rigor, possible that the hierarchic organization of the body of Druids, and the system of its doctrine, was invented in Britain. However, is it more credible that many Druidic schools existed in the continent, and in the Isles, and that one or some of the Britons enjoyed of major celebrity for being more complete the instruction that was imparted therein? In fact, Caesar does not say that all those who wanted to enter in the class of the Druids were obeyed to go and study in Britain, but there went those who were obeyed to receive a more complete education. A new proof that the Britain was not the main center of the Druidic organization is that their general assemblies were celebrated in a consecrated forest, in the country of the Cairnites, which was considered as the center of the Gaul. It has been believed that this forest was in the environs of Drex, and that this city took its name from the Druids. But, his not passes to be a supposition, because the name of Drex, Derocathorques, means a fort nearby a river. In the already quoted book De Bello Gallico, Caesar says that all their men belonged to the elevated classes of the Gaul, figured, already within the nobles, already whiting the Druids. They were in charge of the religious direction of the people, as for the main interpreters and keepers of the laws. The Druids also had power to impose the most severe punishments to those who refused to be submitted to their decisions. Amongst the penalties that they could impose, the most feared was the expulsion of the society. The Druids didn't form a hereditary caste, they were exempt to the service in the field, and the payment of taxes, and for these exceptions and privileges, all the young men of the Gaul aspired to be admitted in the order. The tests to which a novice had to be subjected sometimes lasted 20 years. All the instruction of the Druidic science was communicated orally, but for certain propositions they had a written language, in which they used Greek character. The president of the order, whose charge was elective and lifelong, exerted over the individuals that formed a supreme authority. The Druids taught that soul was immortal. The astrology, geography, theology, and physical sciences were their favorite studies. The Gauls didn't do human sacrifices, but only very rare cases, and on them great criminals were sacrificed. All what it is known in regard to the religious doctrines taught by the Druids is reduced to some fragments that are found in many works of writers of the antiquity, and particularly in Caesar, Diodorus Siculus, Valerius Maximus, Lucan, Cicero, etc. From these fragments result that they believed, as have been said, in the immortality of the soul, and its existence in another world, not being the death more than the point, or moment of separation between two existences. From this belief, is natural that would appear the one of the reward, and the punishment in the other life, belief that explains naturally, the indomitable courage of the Gauls, and their contempt for the death. They taught the position, and the movement of the stars, and the magnitude of heaven and earth. It means that they were dedicated to the study of the astronomy, and undoubtedly to the study of the secrets of the nature, and of the physiology. From this, emerged their pretension to possess the science of the prophecy and magic. Their most important study was the theological study, but about there's none certain data, being very little known its theological system, because the Greek and Latin writers are talking about name and functions and attributes of the Druidic divinities, they referred them to their own theology. Therefore only can be made conjectures, to which the etymologic study can give some probabilities. Caesar says that his main divinity was Mercury, who chaired the arts, the travels and the commerce. Then were in order of importance Apollo, Mars, Jupiter and Minerva. Lucan, and other writers, put at the head of the gods Tetates, and after him, Hasos, Belino, Tyrannes and then Hercules Ecmas. Caesar adds that the Druids pretended to descend from Dis, name that translated as meaning Pluton, and for this origin was that they reckoned by nights, and not by days. The opinion is evidently erroneous, and the error appeared from that Dis, or day, was amongst the Gauls, one of the names of the supreme Bayesian, to whom they called also Isa, or the eternal, and Ebes or Ibol, the infinite. Belinos or Bel or Bis, was one of the names of the sun, to which they called Abli or Athithing, the warm as well, and Granius or Gruinu the luminous. Tethys or Chithias, was the god of fire, the death and destruction. To treat about the religious beliefs of the Gaul, it is required to quote the opinion of the distinguished writer Thury. According to him, the religious beliefs of Gauls were referred to two bodies of symbols and superstitions, two religions completely different. One very ancient, founded on a polytheism, derived from worshipping of the natural phenomenons, and the other, the Druidism, introduced lately by the immigrants of the Cymric race, founded on a material pantheism, metaphysical and mysterious. The main divinities of the Celtic populations were the already quoted, and Ockham Egnis, god of the science of the eloquence, represented under the figure of an old man armed with a mace and a bow, followed by captives subjected by the ears, with chains of gold and amber which emerged from the mouth of the god. Apart from the main divinities, the Druids had other divinities already assimilated to Mars, as Camul, Camulus, Segomen, Beletagods and Cachuix, already to Apollo, as Modlanus and Grainus, and also other divinities which were the deification of the natural phenomenons, as Turan, Terranis, the thunder, Crixiricius, impetuous wind of the northeast, or deification of mountains, forests, Sitites, as Penin, god of the Alps, Vosigans, god of the Vosges, Adina, Archurina, assimilated to Diana, goddess of the forests of Ardens, Nemansis, Vesantis, Luxovia, Nennius, Bornina, Damina, local divinities of Nemours, Debisanzan, of Luxia, of Mariza, of Bourbon, Lency. Penna was the protector goddess of the grooms and the horse trainers. The Druids were very venerated by the people. They had an austere life, and far from the consortium with the rest. They were dressed in a singular way. They usually used a tunic which reached below knee. Provided with the supreme power, they imposed the penalties, declared the war, and made the peace. They could depose the judges and even the king, when their actions were opposed to the laws of the state. They had the privilege to name the judges, who governed the cities annually, and the kings were not elected without their approval. Caesar says that only the nobles could enter in the Druidic order, while Porphyry sustains that was enough with the right of the citizenship. Nevertheless, it is difficult to believe that a so powerful body as the Druidic admitted on its bosom to individuals who not belonged to a determined caste. The Druids formed the first order of the nation. They were the judges in the major part of the public and private matters. They knew all the crimes, the murder, the hereditary issues, the properties, and their sentence to this penalty were considered infamous and impious. They were abandoned by everyone, even their relatives. All the world ran from them, to not be stained with their contact, and they lost all their civil rights, and the protection of the law, and the tribunals. The veneration given to the Druids was so huge, that, if they presented themselves between two combatant armies, the struggle ceased immediately, and the combatants were submitted to their arbitration. As was said before, according to the opinion of the writers of the antiquity, the Druidical doctrine was not written, it was transmitted orally, and the novices were obeyed to study for 20 years to possess the science. It seems, however, that this affirmation is erroneous, and that the error comes from care with which the Druids occulted their science to the profane. With the age, the memory is debilitated inevitably, and if they didn't write anything, would have to result perforce, that the chiefs, that is to say, the oldest ones, would be found inferior to the younger ones, in the details of their doctrine. The Druids had a sacred writing that, according to the tradition, was called Ogham. Thus, is probable that they would have possessed written books, with those characters, that perhaps were, as was indicated before, Greek characters, but this does not mean, as some have believed, that they wrote in Greek. Unfortunately, none of these books have reached to the present. Those who escaped from the edicts of the Roman emperors in the Gaul and Britain were destroyed by the first Christian propagandists, by St. Patrick, in Ireland, and St. Columbanus, in Scotland. The body of the Druids was divided in many classes. The Druids properly said, the soothsayers, the Sarotimos, the Samotes, the Slurs, and the Buts. In respect to the last one, authors opine that they must not figure within the Druids, and others that the Druids were a corporation of ministers dedicated to religious cult, which preceded the order of corporation of the Druids. The bards, as well as the Celts of the Germans, were not, but poets added to the chiefs, and were in charge to sing the great feats of the heroes, to improvise praises, and eulogies, funereal prayers, and war cries. Did they celebrate also the mysteries of their religion as the Celts? Question that is not possible to respond, because, amongst the songs of the bards that have been conserved, there is none containing anything relative to the dogmas, neither the ceremonies of any religion. The prophecy was the common attribute of the Druids. They were all soothsayers, and there is no reason to divide them by classes, under this aspect, except for the exercise of the different functions that they practiced. The Samotes, word derived from sage, ecstasy, were the ecstatic, and the beholder. The Sloers were the introductors, or institutors, and they took their name from the Rilad, who means teaching, and at last the Sarotimros must not have been an especial class, but it had to be called thus to the chiefs, because the name Sarotimros comes from Saranavador, Saunid, which means very venerable. Is then to be believed that Sarodingo was a title and not new class in the Druidic order. There also were Druides, either women or Dorthiers of the Druids, or simply added to the corporation, because it is not possible to admit that the Druids would have permitted the exercise of the magic, prophecy and priesthood to women, who not belonged to the Druidic body, and were submitted to their discipline. And it is indubitable that existed, due to history, speaks of the Gaelish vestals of the Isle Senator, soothsayers and magician, that foresaw that Aelius Diocletian would be emperors, and to Severus Alexander his fatal destiny, were Druides. An inscription found in Metz gives the name Druides to the priestess Evt, Druis Antistissa. According to the opinion of Thierry, the Druidism was already in decadence before the age of Caesar. Since some time ago, the nobles on one side, and the people on the other, jealous for the great power of the Druids, achieved to reduce them gradually their political influence. Renaud, one of the better writers that have studied the Druidism, sustains that the ancient Druids were the first who taught with great clarity the doctrine of the immortality of the soul, and that they had a so perfect conception of the real nature of God, as the same Jews. If later they permitted, in the cult to other divinities, was with the objective to conciliate the Druidism, with the ideas professed by the uneducated classes more disposed to believe in semi-gods, and divinities that to conceive a unique God. According to the same Renaud, the Druidism finally declined and disappeared, because an element necessary for life in every religion, the love, or charity. The Christianity gave such element, and the Druidism disappeared. But it disappeared after the fulfillment of an important mission, the conservation of the idea of the unity of God in a part of Europe. If this theory, supported in very incomplete information, or in reasoning, more or less acceptable, as to prove amongst the Gauls, of some ideas referring to the real nature of God, and his relation with man, which were degenerated later in coarse superstition, if it is true or not, is something that must not be discussed here.